ch15, or the autonomic nervous system, is actually the shortest chapter in this course, and actually I'm going to shorten it even more so. We get into the parasympathetic portion of the autonomic nervous system. There's only a few things we're going to have you point out for the final exam. Otherwise, we'll keep this short, a lot shorter than some of the previous chapters we've done so far this semester. First, let's look at differences between the somatic and the autonomic nervous system. First, the somatic nervous system is going to include both sensory motor neurons. And most of the sensory neurons are going to come from the majority of the outside environment, which includes touch, pain, temperature, sight, hearing, taste, smell. And then also the internal will be equilibrium and also the sense of proprioception, which is what we call position sense. If you were to close your eyes and then very simply touch your finger to your nose, you would know where your arm, your elbow, and your finger is in relation to your nose and how to get it there and back. Now, the difference being the autonomic nervous system is also going to get information from the sensory receptors, but it's going to be all internal. In this case, the organs, blood vessels, and also in the muscles themselves. But also from a motor aspect, it will affect the muscles as well as glands. Now, when we look at the somatic nervous system, we're going to see one type of connection, which is going to be very familiar to you from the spinal nerves and the cranial nerve sections. Very simply, you have a myelinated motor neuron that's going to synapse within a skeletal muscle, and the neurotransmitter is going to be acetylcholine. So again, it's only going to be this particular scenario. You're going to have one nerve traveling directly from the spinal cord. The axon will synapse at neuromuscular junction to a skeletal muscle. So the somatic nervous system is going to be situated in this particular fashion. In a couple seconds, you'll see how the autonomic nervous system is going to have a couple different scenarios, usually going to be a two-nerve system. So the main difference here, again, the somatic nervous system is going to be a single nerve system, single nerve synapse to the effector, and it's only going to be with the skeletal muscle, and acetylcholine will be the only transmitter that we'll be using. Now, as far as the autonomic nervous system goes, instead of having a single neuron, it's going to be a two-neuron system. So you're going to have one's going to be preganglionic and one's going to be postganglionic. The majority of the time, the preganglionic will still be myelinated. The postganglionic will be unmyelinated. So in this case, the cell body for the preganglionic neuron will have the cell body in the central nervous system, whether it be either in the spinal cord or in the brain. It'll extend to a ganglion different than the dorsal root ganglion we had seen before in the spinal nerve, mainly because that one is for sensory nerve cell bodies. We're talking more so for motor cell bodies in the ganglion here. Then you have a second neuron that will synapse at the ganglion itself. It will be unmyelinated. It'll actually go to a different type of effector. In this case, not skeletal like we see in somatic, but in this case, going to go either to the smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, the heart, of course, or any type of gland as its effector. So when we look at the divisions of the autonomic nervous system, we're going to look at both sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions, and we'll talk about that in just a couple slides here. But first, looking at the sympathetic, and this is going to be partitioned into where the effectors are going to be the end result for each synapse. So look at the top one here. There's going to be a sympathetic preganglionic neuron, myelinated. It's going to synapse at the ganglion. Acetylcholine is going to be your neurotransmitter. And then as it goes to the effector, the neurotransmitter is not going to be acetylcholine. In this case, it's going to be norepinephrine. But the effector is going to be the same. It's going to be glands, cardiac muscle, or smooth muscle. The next one down, the other sympathetic preganglion neuron we're going to see will also derive from the central nervous system. It'll synapse in this sense to the adrenal medulla, again using acetylcholine. It will also use norepinephrine and sometimes epinephrine. But in this case, the second neuron will go to the blood vessel themselves. Now, thankfully, the parasympathetic, we only see one type here. The parasympathetic is going to be myelinated in the first preganglionic neuron. It's going to synapse in the parasympathetic postganglionic neuron with acetylcholine to an unmyelinated neuron. And this time, the effectors again will be either the glands, cardiac muscle, or the smooth muscle. You may remember when we talked about the nervous system and the different divisions of it. The autonomic nervous system will have two competing divisions. One is the sympathetic nervous system, which is used for fight or flight. This basically increases stimulation to areas that increase alertness and metabolism to basically get you ready for any kind of emergency, whether you have to flee from danger or if you have to stand your ground. The flip side of that is the parasympathetic division, which is known mostly for rest and digest, or back when I was in school, feed or breed. This will slow down certain types of body activities, and will actually either promote either repair or reproduction. So here's a handy little chart that'll give you the main differences between the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. As far as sensory input, most of your somatic nervous system will be supplied by somatic senses and your special senses. Autonomic is going to come mostly from your internal receptors or interoceptors, with some limited input from the somatic senses and the special senses. Motor output will be voluntary control from the cerebral cortex. Involuntary control is going to come from the hypothalamus, limbic system, some areas from the spinal cord and cerebral cortex for the autonomic nervous system. As far as motor neuron pathways, for somatic, it's going to be a one neuron pathway. Somatic motor neurons will come from the CNS and go right to the effector. For the autonomic nervous system, it's going to be a two neuron pathway, so you have a preganglionic and postganglionic neurons. Very simply, the effectors will be a little different. The effectors in this case will be smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands, whereas somatic nervous system will be skeletal muscle only. Neurotransmitters and hormones, all somatic motor neurons will use acetylcholine, and that's it. With the autonomic nervous system, as far as sympathetic and parasympathetic, sympathetic will use acetylcholine at the preganglionic neurons, the postganglionic neurons releasing norepinephrine to the effectors, again, smooth muscle, cardiac, and glands. All parasympathetic will use both pre and postganglionic. We're going to use acetylcholine. The chromaffin cells of the adrenal medulla will release the epinephrine, and norepinephrine would be the one oddball out of this. That's going to basically synapse in the adrenal medulla and go out to blood vessels. So the responses for the somatic is a contraction of skeletal muscle. The autonomic nervous system will cause contraction or relaxation of smooth muscle, increasing or decreasing heart rate, or increase or decrease secretions of the glands. So again, for the autonomic nervous system, you're going to have division of two types of motor neurons: the preganglionic, where cell body will be found in the brain or spinal cord, therefore in the central nervous system, and postganglionic. In this case, you have either a sympathetic or a parasympathetic ganglion, where the sympathetic I'll show are very close to the spinal cord, whereas the parasympathetic tend to be very close to whatever effector that they're controlling. Now for the sympathetic division, the cell bodies of the preganglionic neurons will be found in the spinal cord, but only at certain levels. First, they're going to branch off at the lateral horns of the gray matter. So if you remember the different horns you're going to find, the anterior horn, posterior horn in the spinal cord levels. The anterior horn is going to be for motor, the posterior horn is going to be for sensory. The lateral horn is dedicated for the sympathetic division here. And it's only found in all 12 levels of the thoracic and the first 2 or 3 lumbar segments. So if you look here, again, you can see from T1 down to about L2 or L3, you see all different divisions of the sympathetic nervous system and where it's going to affect to. All these will have some kind of manifestation, either fight or flight kind of response. So in this case, going to the eye, going to different types of glands, increase the heart rate, increase your respiratory rate. It'll actually increase activity with the liver to produce more sugar to get into the bloodstream, so it'll break down glycogen. It'll actually slow down your gastrointestinal tract and the genitourinary areas as well. So it has an inhibitory effect in some of those areas, but excitatory effect to get more blood flow to the blood vessels, more blood flow to the muscles, increase the heart rate, so you can burn more sugar to get yourself ready for battle or for fleeing, and it'll also help you dilate the eyes so you can take in more light so you can see what's going on. Your sympathetic trunk, which I'll show you in a couple seconds here, is very close to the areas of the spinal cord where it's going to synapse from. So again, T1 down to L3 in most people will encompass the entirety of the sympathetic division for the preganglionic neurons. Now in the parasympathetic division, these are going to be found in 4 cranial nerves, 3, 7, 9, and 10 in the brainstem, and the lateral gray matter of the sacral segments 2 through 4. So you see there's a pretty good division between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic divisions. So the parasympathetic, again, just found 4 cranial nerves, cranial nerve 3, 7, 9, and 10. So 3 being oculomotor, that's where the accommodation reflex is going to come into play. Cranial nerve number 7 would be the facial nerve. 9 and 10 is going to be glossopharyngeal and the vagus nerve. These are going to be found primarily in the brainstem and also in the lateral gray matter of the sacral segments 2 through 4. So almost at the both ends of the spinal cord and the central nervous system. So you can see here where it branches off to. So these will have different types of ganglions, usually away from the spinal column and closer to the actual effector. So these will help promote more blood flow to the gastrointestinal area. It will slow down the heart rate It'll slow down respiratory for more deep breathing. Actually increase urine flow as well as feces. They tend to constrict the eyes more so for relaxation and such. Now, of course, there are two types of autonomic ganglia. They have the sympathetic and parasympathetic. But the sympathetic is also partially partitioned again into two different types of ganglia as well. One is going to be the sympathetic trunk ganglia, which are found on the vertical row of either side of the vertebral column. So it's going to lay anterior and lateral to the vertebral column, and also the paravertebral ganglia, which is going to be just another ganglia adjacent to that, more anterior to the vertebral column, very close to your large abdominal arteries. So these motor pathways will synapse in 4 different ways, and actually there's a diagram on the next page here, and so I'll read these through very quickly, but I'll show you, it's a little better to show you the 4 different pathways on the next slide. So what ends up happening is your synapse will occur from the preganglionic to the postganglionic, and then basically the axonal synapse, either in the first ganglion reaches at the same level, it may actually ascend or descend to a higher or lower ganglion, usually 3 or 4 layers up or down, before synapsing with the postganglionic neurons, or actually it may continue directly to the sympathetic trunk ganglion to the end of the prevertebral ganglion and synapse with postganglionic neurons, or occasionally it may go directly to the adrenal medulla. So following the axon from the lateral horn, looking at number 1, if you follow the pathway first, you can see it'll synapse first at the sympathetic trunk ganglion, or it may actually travel upward or downward, so ascend or descend up the trunk, and synapse in number 2, in this case, looks like it's going up one particular level, and then we'll synapse with the postganglionic neuron to the effector, or occasionally may bypass the sympathetic trunk ganglion and go right to the prevertebral ganglion instead, and actually synapse with the effector at that point, or it may bypass all 3 of those positions. So it'll actually bypass both the sympathetic trunk ganglion or the prevertebral ganglion and go right to the adrenal gland and synapse with the chromaffin cells for the release of the epinephrine and norepinephrine. Now, around the abdomen and pelvis, you're going to have different types of plexes, both for the sympathetic and the parasympathetic systems. Those are going to include the celiac plexus, the superior mesenteric plexus, the inferior mesenteric plexus, renal plexus, and the hypogastric plexus. So these plexes are going to be named after the artery they're going to be distributed with. So other than knowing what they're named, that's all I need you to know at this point. Don't worry so much about where they innervate to. Just know that very simply they'll have both sympathetic and parasympathetic innervations. So both innervations from both sides of the autonomic nervous system. Now again, for the sympathetic preganglionic neurons, these will be found in the spinal cord through all thoracic segments and use the first 2 or 3 lumbar segments as well. Now the sympathetic trunk, however, can branch both superiorly and inferiorly from those particular sections. So in this case, you could have up to 2 cervical, 11, 12 thoracic, 4 or 5 lumbar, 4 or 5 sacral, and then 1 coccygeal ganglion on top of that. So these are going to be just lateral and anterior to the spinal column themselves. Now again, for the parasympathetic, these are going to be found mostly in the brainstem. The nuclei are found in the brainstem and the lower grade matter of the 2nd through 4th sacral segments of the spinal cord. So they're going to come with the same 4 cranial nerves that we talked about before, so cranial nerve number 3, 7, 9, and 10. The sacral parasympathetic outflow will come through sacral segments 2 through 4. Now the main difference you'll see between synapses from the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic. The sympathetic will have the ganglion very close to the spinal column themselves, whereas the parasympathetic will synapse very close to the actual effector themselves. You can see here in particular the pre-synaptic neuron and the preganglionic neuron and the postganglionic neuron. The postganglionic neuron will have a very short way to go, as it will synapse very closely to the urinary bladder shown in the diagram here. This is a brief overview of everything we just talked about before. This one goes over the sympathetic versus parasympathetic section of the spinal cord, as well as the sympathetic trunk ganglion, and also the neurotransmitters as well. If you want to take a few minutes and look through that, when you're ready to move on to the next slide, go ahead and do so. And with the autonomic nervous system, neurotransmitters and receptors, certain neurons can be known as either cholinergic or adrenergic. Cholinergic very simply means that they have receptors that will bind with acetylcholine for the cholinergic, or epinephrine or norepinephrine for the adrenergic. The old name used to be adrenaline and noradrenaline for epinephrine and norepinephrine. It's since been changed in recent years, but the name of the receptors is still the same. They'll still be adrenergic. So again, acetylcholine will bind with cholinergic receptors on neurons, and the noradrenaline will synapse with the adrenergic receptors themselves. Now the cholinergic receptors also will partition. We're going to find nicotinic receptors found on the postganglionic neurons. So the acetylcholine will be released by the presynaptic neuron. The nicotinic receptors will be found on the postganglionic neurons found in both the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. You're going to find muscarinic receptors are going to be found on the effectors in particular. So you find these on sweat glands, you'll find these on muscle cells and also cardiac cells. So let's look at the structure of the different neurotransmitters and receptors found in 3 different scenarios. If you look at all 3 scenarios, whether the 2 on top for sympathetic or the 1 on the bottom for parasympathetic, if you look at both the preganglionic neurons and the postganglionic neurons, the preganglionic neurons will release acetylcholine. So you're going to have cholinergic receptors on the postganglionic neuron. So they're going to be nicotinic types of receptors. Now if you look at the postganglionic neuron going to the effector, we're looking to basically cause some contraction on the effector cell, especially on scenario A, using epinephrine, norepinephrine to affect the effector cell to excite that. Looking at the parasympathetic division on the bottom there, they're going to release acetylcholine, will have the opposite effect. If you look at letter B, you're going to have the postganglionic neuron will release acetylcholine on a muscarinic receptor that's going to increase sweat cell production in that particular area. So again, looking at all 3 from a structural perspective, the acetylcholine is going to bind from the preganglionic to the postganglionic neurons. They're going to be cholinergic, in this case, nicotinic receptors. If you look at the postganglionic synapses, you can look at adrenergic because they're releasing the epinephrine to the effector, whereas you have muscarinic, which is going to be acetylcholine, both in sympathetic and parasympathetic areas. In this case, the sympathetic will excite the sweat glands, but in the parasympathetic, it's going to have a relaxation effect on the effector cell. In this case, looks like a smooth muscle cell. So as far as the cholinergic receptors, we find these mostly in the postsynaptic plasma membrane. It can be activated by neurotransmitter acetylcholine. The nicotinic, you're going to find these in both the postganglionic sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons, found in the chromatin cells of the adrenal medulla, or the sarcolemma of the skeletal muscle. So the nicotinic can either be excitable, where the impulses will go to the postganglionic neurons, or it'll increase the production of epinephrine and norepinephrine, or also cause excitation of contraction of a particular muscle. Now, as far as muscarinic, these will be found in the parasympathetic postganglionic neurons for the effectors, will be inhibitory, in some cases excitatory. The sweat glands are innervated by cholinergic sympathetic postganglionic neurons. This will increase the production of the sweat glands. But as far as skeletal muscle goes, this is going to have more of an inhibitory effect or relaxation to increase vasodilation. Now for adrenergic, there's quite a bit going on in this particular table. What I want you to not focus on is different types of receptors of adrenergic. What I'm more concerned with is knowing that these are going to be activated by the hormones norepinephrine and epinephrine, and pay attention to the effects of the receptor activation. So basically, you're with the excitation or contraction of the muscles for the dilation of the pupil, closing of the sphincters. Because again, you don't want gastrointestinal getting in the way of any kind of fight or flight. You're increasing water secretion, increasing potassium secretion, increasing sweating. You're basically going to relax the muscles around the smooth muscles to increase vasodilation around the capillary beds as well as the major arteries, and also increase airflow through the larynx. And this will give you a slight window of what kind of things are inhibited, or most of your feed and breathe type of functions tend to get inhibited when epinephrine and norepinephrine are secreted. So naturally, you will have glycogenolysis or breakdown of liver glycogen for more blood flow of sugar. You're going to shut down the gastrointestinal area. You're going to break down more triglycerides. You're going to increase thermogenesis or increase heat production. You're going to relax the ciliary muscle in the eye to provide more light to enter the eye so you can see more clearly. So basically anything you think of that will increase blood flow to the muscles, increase energy and resources to muscles in particular, will be more so for the epinephrine and norepinephrine. So this is one of the major sympathetic neurotransmitters. So basically the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions, if you haven't figured this out already, are very antagonistic of each other. Typically the sympathetic will shut down the parasympathetic divisions, and vice versa depending on what's being stimulated the most. Now, when you study this chapter, or this table in particular, as well as the next two tables, are probably the most important parts of the entire chapter. This gives you the breakdown and the comparison between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions. It tells you where it's distributed, it tells you what kind of ganglion locations there would be, what kind of axons are being used, neurotransmitters, and what kind of physiological effects. The next two tables go into further breakdown as far as which one it will innervate the heart in certain directions, which one will innervate the liver, the skeletal muscles, so on and so forth. So very simply, for the sympathetic, you're going to find it all throughout the body, in the skin, sweat glands, adipose tissues, smooth muscles, the blood vessels. Mostly the parasympathetic is mostly in the head and also the viscera, and some of the blood vessels themselves. Your preganglionic neuron cell bodies are going to be mostly loud great horns in the thoracolumbar area, so all thoracics and L2 to L3. These are going to be all the axons are going to be in the thoracolumbar outflow. Whereas the parasympathetic, you can find these in the four cranial nerves we mentioned before, so 3, 7, 9, and 10. Also spinal cord segments S2 to S4. As far as the ganglia goes, you have both the sympathetic trunk and the prevertebral ganglia in the sympathetic division. In the parasympathetic, these are your terminal ganglia. Your small ganglia found right by very close to the actual effectors, usually along the gastrointestinal tract, and also the circulatory areas as well. Again, ganglia location is going to be very close to the central nervous system. Usually be found very deeply into the visceral effectors in the parasympathetic divisions. Again, the axon length for the preganglionic neurons and the postganglionic neurons will be very short. In the preganglionic, they're very long postganglionic. Be vice versa in the parasympathetic, where long preganglionic, very short postganglionic. The white and gray rainbow communicante is only found in the sympathetic, not found in the parasympathetic. And again, as far as neurotransmitters go, you're going to have acetylcholine as well as epinephrine and norepinephrine, whereas acetylcholine can be both secretory and excitatory. Norepinephrine will be all excitatory, whereas the parasympathetic, you simply have only acetylcholine, which works both excitatory and inhibitory as well. So again, physiological effects: sympathetic, always think fight or flight. Parasympathetic will be rest and digest, or feed and breathe. The next few tables give you a very good breakdown of what body parts are going to be mostly invaded by the sympathetic or the parasympathetic, or both. In some very extreme cases. Some have a very polarizing effect from one side to the other. Some are mostly innervated by one branch of the autonomic nervous system and not by the other. And some others will have almost the exact same response on both sides here. So I'll just point out a few here. So basically the adrenal medulla mostly is going to be innervated by the sympathetic division. So it's going to promote the secretion of epinephrine and norepinephrine. The tear glands, slight secretion on both the sympathetic and parasympathetic, a little more so in the parasympathetic. You notice the pancreas in particular will have an opposing effect with the sympathetic versus parasympathetic. So as long as you keep in mind, again, the feed and breathe versus the fight or flight. Naturally, for digestion, you want to slow down ingestion, so when you're in any kind of fight or flight mode, so sympathetic division will inhibit the secretion of the pancreas, where the parasympathetic, once you're ready to feed and breathe or rest and digest, will actually secrete more digestive enzymes. And you follow that innervation as far down to the other glands as well. Most of your glands will be more excitatory for the sympathetic, and really no innervation control on the parasympathetic whatsoever. So as long as the sympathetic division is not being utilized, then those particular glands are not really actively going to be secreting their particular constituents. If you look at the cardiac or heart muscle, very simply, it's a no-brainer. Increase heart rate with the sympathetic and decrease heart rate with the parasympathetic. As far as smooth muscle goes, in some instances, especially around the radial muscle or the iris, it's going to dilate the pupil so it can contract. And then if you want to constrict the pupil, that's more for the parasympathetic division. If you look at the lungs, the bronchial muscles, it'll relax in sympathetic to allow more airflow, and it'll contract during the parasympathetic division to kind of slow things down for you. As far as the gallbladder goes, again, it's going to be relaxation to basically facilitate storage of the bile. But it'll contract when you're trying to release bile into actual small intestine. So it's a very particular set of parameters there for the gallbladder itself, for the sympathetic versus parasympathetic. So we see more of a polarizing effect on this particular table here. So you look at the stomach, the intestines, you're going to have a decreased motility and tone or contraction of sphincters in the sympathetic area to kind of slow things down, but it's more increased motility rate or relaxation of sphincters in the parasympathetic areas. The spleen primarily is controlled mostly by the sympathetic, not really controlled too much by the parasympathetic. The ureters, increased motility in both the sympathetic and parasympathetic. Urinary bladder tends to relax the muscle, but contracts the sphincters on the internal area because you don't want to be having to urinate while you're trying to get out of danger. Naturally, relaxation more so in the parasympathetic division. As far as the uterus goes, naturally when it'll promote contraction when you're pregnant for the sympathetic, so it's more like a positive feedback loop there. It will inhibit contraction naturally in the non-pregnant woman. Not much to control there by the parasympathetic. As far as the sexual organs go, it's kind of a mixed bag here. You're going to contraction of the smooth muscle and the vas deferens in the male, whereas you can have more of a parasympathetic division control with vasodilation both in the female and the male. As far as like hair follicles or having your erectopili muscles stand the hairs on end, you see it's primarily only in the sympathetic division. As far as smooth muscle goes in the different types of glands, you see vasoconstriction was going to inhibit secretion of saliva and gastric juices, while on the flip side, you'll have that increased with the parasympathetic division will stimulate those types of secretions. As far as the coronary arterioles, you're going to relax those muscles in the sympathetic and contract them in the parasympathetic. You're going to see just the opposite effect seen in the sympathetic areas because you want to contract the skin and mucosal arterioles to get more blood flow to the muscles themselves, whereas they may vasodilate more so in the parasympathetic. With the skeletal muscle arterioles, it's going to contraction to allow more vasoconstriction in certain types, but on the flip side, you have some vasodilation with the sympathetic. And actually, no innervation there for the parasympathetic. And you kind of see the same thing, the abdominal arterioles, the brain, the kidney, and also the veins there as well. It's almost like a situational type of thing. You have contraction and also dilation in certain areas, depending on locally what's needed at the particular spot. So basically, you're going to run into the same kind of reflex arcs that we're going to have back when we look in the spinal areas. You're also going to have the same thing found in the autonomic reflex arc. This will have a negative feedback effect, but you have the same type of components you have in reflex arc from the spinal reflexes. You have a receptor, you have the sensory neuron, integrating center found in the central nervous system, followed by the motor neurons and the effector. So of course the autonomic nervous system is going to be heavily involved in homeostasis, trying to maintain the balance points along different types of functions throughout the body, whether it be body temperature, whether it be heart rate, whether it be sodium balance found in the blood, sugar balance in the blood, calcium like we talked about with the muscles in particular. So you're constantly having a negative feedback effect and trying to maintain that balance point on a myriad of different functions all throughout the body. So naturally we can see the autonomic nervous system is going to have influence over all of the body systems. This kind of touches upon very briefly how it interacts with different systems all throughout the body. Naturally, the integumentary system, just being able to detect different types of senses coming in and acting upon them through the integumentary system. The skeletal system, trying to maintain the right kind of balance for calcium and phosphates for bone strength. We see what happens when you have too little or too much calcium, different types of diseases. The muscular system, you kind of see control of muscle tone. Having too much calcium, not enough calcium, can also throw things off dramatically. We look at different types of postures with the cerebellum, trying to maintain position, and we see how quickly those can go awry as well. Endocrine system, we didn't talk about too much, but obviously trying to maintain balance of the hormones, very important, but more touched upon in HAP2. Cardiovascular system, we talked about before, with increasing or decreasing the heart rate, maintaining the right kind of dilation on some of the arterioles around the cardiac arterioles, also monitoring the amount of electrolytes found in the blood and also the blood pressure, as well as glucose and so on and so forth. Lymphatic system, again, we touched on very briefly with the sympathetic system controlling the spleen, but again, more for HAP2. Respiratory system, again, controlling the heart, respiratory rate, also the depth of respiration, and also trying to maintain the right diameter on the larynx to allow proper airflow. Digestive system, again, more so tied into the parasympathetic system for the right amount of motility to allow certain things to flow through, but then slow enough for the body to pull whatever nutrition they can from whatever food we're taking in. Of course, the urinary system is more so for getting rid of liquid wastes, maintain proper pH balance at the same time. Reproductive systems, you can go as far as getting the body ready for suckling for an infant, or of course getting ready for any kind of sexual behaviors as well. So again, this kind of concludes the autonomic nervous system. As you can see, it's a very short chapter. There will be an assignment tied into this. Normally, during lab, I would have you guys actually do something in the last lab, more fun type thing. So in lieu of doing questions for this lab and for this lecture, I'll have you actually create on your own just a hypothetical type of system here to basically experiment on one particular type of system, whether it be a sympathetic or parasympathetic. So look to the lab sections. I'll give you a little more information on what you can do. And it doesn't have to be really involved. It'll be very simple. And you'll see when we get into the next lab, you'll see which types of things we'll look for as far as heart rate, vasodilation. You look at different types of eye motions. Be very simple ways to kind of look at different ways we can actually test both the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. So again, look for the lab. There are no questions for this particular lecture, but we'll do something a little special for the lab, almost like a single project kind of thing before the end of the semester.